Clock News follows in a minute after the weather details from Michael Fish.
Good evening to you. If you want an easy life, then don't be a weatherman. Yesterday, you recall, we had troubles with this area of low pressure, and as it turned out, it headed southeastwards and not northeastwards, and that's the reason why there was only snow really in Wales and the southwest. And although that's moving out of the way now, and we've got a quieter period, although still in those cold easterly winds, it looks as if we've got more problems to come, another area of low pressure heading towards us, and that's going to do a repeat performance tomorrow night, and whether it snows or not very much hangs in the balance. However, as far as tonight's concerned, there's still some of that snow around over the south of Wales, parts of southwest England, but I think as the night goes on, that should very, very gradually die away, perhaps hanging on for a while down in Devon and Cornwall, but even there by the morning, most of it should have petered out. And then for most places, a dry, fairly misty night, a cold night again, not as cold as recently, but cold enough for a widespread frost, so do watch out for those icy patches on the roads, and just here and there, perhaps the odd flake of snow or spot or two of rain or drizzle. And then for tomorrow, well, I think really a rather misty, murky day, really, for most parts of the country, fairly cloudy too, although hopefully as the day goes on it will brighten up in one or two spots. For most of the country it's going to stay dry, but just here and there will be a spot or two of rain or a light flurry of snow, chiefly near to the east coast, although late on in the day in Devon and Cornwall, some more general rain or sleet.
On BBC Two now, David Vincent continues his struggle against alien forces in The Invaders. This is BBC One.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Sue Lawley and Nicholas Witchell.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. The cost of a mortgage is to go up by about £11 a week on average. The Building Societies Association has recommended a rise of between 1 and 1.25% next month. Police have a lead in the hunt for the man who stole the army payroll and killed the 3 men carrying it. 2 witnesses saw a soldier dressed like this. We report on the old people who are struggling to keep warm in some of the worst weather for 20 years.
How are you feeling this morning?
Mrs. Thatcher's been telling the Germans why we'll celebrate the day the Nazis surrendered. It was a rebirth of freedom for everyone, she said. In Madras, victory for England. India avoided an innings defeat, but we went 2-1 up in the Test series. And Wilfrid Bramble, best known as Albert Steptoe, has died at the age of 72. The week, which began with the government coming to the aid of a tumbling pound, has ended with house buyers facing higher monthly bills for their mortgages. The building societies will probably put up their interest rates next month by between 1 and 1.25%. That was the recommendation of their association. The Halifax and the Nationwide have already announced their increase of 1.25%. The others are likely to follow. The rise was almost inevitable after the government ordered an increase of 1.5% in bank interest rates on Monday. They did it to help the pound, which has certainly steadied over the past few days and closed tonight at $1.12.1. And there was another piece of cheering news for the government today. The inflation rate for 1984 had come in only a shade above target at 4.6%. And the stock exchange, which has been practically ignoring the problems of the pound, broke through the magical 1,000 mark as the Financial Times index closed at a record 1,004.4. A report first on the mortgage rate from John Fryer.
Building society managers went into this morning's meeting without a common view. Some said a rise was inevitable and should be done now. Others felt there was no need to rush. But their chairman said there was no alternative.
I believe we have a strong obligation to our investors, 30 million of them, many of them, of course, who depend on the income that they get from their building society investment. It is only reasonable that they have a fair return, and we think that this adjusts the position appropriately. The borrower, yes, has to pay, but we've kept that down as much as possible, and I think it's a reasonable and responsible approach that has been made.
The societies are still fairly flush with funds, and that was one reason why Abbey National mounted a spirited lobby against an increase today. There's sharp competition between societies these days, and Abbey National's been accused by its rivals of just touting for business, because if other rates go up, so will theirs.
We had the second highest inflow ever in December, over £1 billion for the industry as a whole. January has started reasonably well. There's been no signs of the inflow dropping off in the last few days. So that is why we were saying that it was unnecessary. It was an unnecessary rushed decision to make those changes today.
If mortgages do go up by 1.25%, the monthly repayment on a £10,000 mortgage will increase by £5.80. For a £20,000 loan, it'll be £11.60, and on £30,000, the repayment will rise by £17.40. The cost of loans varies slightly between societies, and each will be meeting next week to decide where to pitch its new rate. Today's move reverses the cut in mortgage rates last November, which for many borrowers is only just taking effect. The building societies placed the blame firmly on the run on the pound, which has in turn pushed up interest rates generally. But it will do nothing to help the government in its battle to keep prices down. The government announced today that the annual inflation rate dropped to 4.6% last month. But that's set to rise, as today's mortgage increase will add another 0.4% to the index.
Detectives hunting the gunman who killed 2 soldiers and a retired army major in a wages snatch have a new lead. 2 witnesses saw a man dressed as a soldier hurrying away from the scene of yesterday's triple murder at Pennycook near Edinburgh. This report from Mike Smart.
The man seen hurrying along the secluded country lane where the bodies of the 3 murdered men were found very soon afterwards was dressed as Corporal David Campbell was at this afternoon's press conference in the uniform of a Scottish Lowland regiment. One witness, a hill walker who also discovered the Pale Roll Party's abandoned Land Rover, saw the uniformed man walking about 100 yards from where the vehicle had been left in a ditch. Another witness saw him running a further 100 yards along the road, but he didn't seem to be armed or carrying anything. Now the police are hoping to interview all 600 men at Corporal Campbell's barracks and check the ammunition store. They've already established that no soldier was absent without leave yesterday. The police say the sightings are an important lead.
As we haven't traced this individual yet, he obviously has considerable importance as he's in an area at or around the material time. It's self-evident. We very much like to know who he was and what he was doing there.
Would you describe him at the moment then as your most important lead?
He is one of our most important leads as of now.
Although most of the police inquiries are now centred around the 2 sightings of the man in uniform, senior officers are keen that potential witnesses don't necessarily assume that he was a serving soldier.
The southwest of England and parts of Wales have been experiencing the worst winter weather people there have known for a number of years. Cornwall was effectively cut off for a time this morning, and tonight only main roads are passable. The West Country took the worst of the overnight weather. According to the weatherman, the blizzards forecast for central and southern areas of the country were blown off course by strong winds. Tonight, much of southwest Britain is under deep snow. Some villages are cut off, and police say in some places conditions are getting worse. They've told motorists not to travel unless they have to. Chris Lowe reports.
Cornwall suffered its worst snowfall for 15 years, and the county's road links with the rest of Britain were cut. Police advised drivers to keep off the roads, and motorists heading for Cornwall across the Tamar Bridge were warned to go no further. Many isolated villages were cut off under 8 inches of snow. Farmers brought their livestock down from the high moors, and the city of Plymouth was brought to a standstill, with hundreds of workers being sent home early, many of them on foot. There's been heavy snow in Wales too, and the police have been advising drivers without four-wheel drive vehicles to keep off the mountain roads. Most of the main routes have been just passable, but many minor roads have been completely blocked as high winds whipped up the snow, leaving some drivers completely stranded. It's the same story in the west of England, where 6 inches of snow have fallen in the last 24 hours. One county, Wiltshire, has used up its entire winter allocation of salt, and some gritting crews are sleeping in their cabs so that snow clearance can go on round the clock. In Gloucestershire, police found a man in a wheelchair heading up the hard shoulder of the M5. He said he'd broken down and was looking for an emergency phone. For the weathermen, the last 24 hours have been rather embarrassing. Earlier this week, they unveiled their new radar system, designed to make short-range forecasting even more accurate. Last night, however, it came unstuck, because we were told that London and the southeast would fall victim to the worst blizzard for years. In the event, scarcely a flake of snow has fallen, because at the last minute, the bad weather changed course, and it's now on its way to the Mediterranean.
Well, with the weathermen predicting sub-zero nighttime temperatures for several more days yet, there's increasing concern for Britain's old people. Welfare organisations have today urged everyone to keep a close watch on elderly neighbours, especially for signs that they might be at risk from the cold. And as Andrew Harvey reports, the problem is already putting increasing pressure on many local authorities.
The big freeze demands long hours and extra vigilance from nurses and social workers.
Hello there. How are you this morning?
Oh, right, thanks. Wish you'd leave me alone.
Oh,
Often their patients, in a desperate attempt to keep warm, present a pathetic picture.
what will you have for lunch
I
today?
don't know.
Ethel Lepage is in her 90s, living alone in a West London basement. With just a single fire in her living room, the gas oven in the kitchen is kept burning all day to add a little extra warmth. But it's only the 3 visits a day from nurses like Linda Berkery that prevent Mrs. Lepage becoming just another hypothermia statistic.
I just feel your
The
tummy.
effects of extreme cold are reckoned to have killed 35,000 people last year. Many health workers now have emergency hypothermia packs ready to rush to severe cases, containing everything from hot water bottles and extra food to a gas stove and warm bedding. But as the present freeze goes on, local authorities have an impossible task, trying to identify all those at risk. This 3-bedroomed house is owned by Hilda Littlejohn, yet for weeks she's been living in a single room downstairs. She spends much of the time in bed, sheltering from the freezing temperatures.
It's very bad because I got a job. I mean, it takes me hours to get warm I put all these things on. And I've got a job to hold anything in my hands, and the things just go on the floor. You know, I mean, I get no circulation in my hands. My hands all go white and dead. Even in bed, that happens.
The important thing is really to choose a room, it's usually the living room, that they're going to sleep in as well as live in, and really make sure that room is warm, up to 70 if at all possible. And once they're in the room, to stay in that room as far as possible, live in it. And the other thing too is to make sure they have at least 1 hot meal a day, plenty of hot drinks. And a good tip is to actually fill a flask at night before you go to bed with hot tea or coffee, whatever you like. So you've got a hot drink in the night as well as first thing in the morning. And not to have a lot of very thick clothing on, but lots and lots of layers of thin clothing that's closely woven so that you get lots of layers of air in between the clothing.
Now, a good neighbour approach is being urged by old people's organisations. As the cold weather goes on, they say, only increased vigilance will save thousands of the elderly from illness or even death.
Andrew Harvey reporting. The Prime Minister has said the West is on the verge of a great step forward in its relations with the Soviet Union. After talks in Bonn with the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, she said the American-Soviet agreement to resume talks on nuclear arms control gave new hope. She also said she hoped Germans and Russians would attend British national celebrations of the VE Day anniversary to mark not the defeat of Germany, but 40 years of peace and freedom. From Bonn, here's our diplomatic editor, John Simpson.
In the winter landscape which greeted Mrs. Thatcher's helicopter as it came down in the grounds of the presidential palace, the snow lay deep and crisp and more or less even. But because in Germany standards are maintained, the red carpet was laid out for her, snow or no snow. And huskies might have suited the conditions better than the police dogs which patrolled the grounds. This never looked like being a controversial meeting. Europe's 2 foremost conservatives see eye to eye on almost everything, and any points of disagreement were fielded by the team of ministers they brought with them. Patrick Jenkin, for instance, was buttonholed about the British pollution that's causing a smog hazard here. The 2 foreign ministers, meanwhile, chatted about East-West relations, the most important subject on the leaders' agenda, too. But as they settled down with their backs to the snowscape, the question most people wanted answered was how the two countries plan to celebrate the 40th anniversary of VE Day in May. Chancellor Kohl's government has been changing its mind almost as much as Mrs. Thatcher's about it all. But he said it would be a day of remembering the terrible things done in Germany's name and the fact that it was a day of liberation for Germans, liberation from Nazism. Like West Germany, we'll have our own separate celebration in Britain, but the details still seem uncertain.
So naturally, we would wish to have, we would expect to see our ambassador from Germany, and of course, we would wish also expect to see the ambassador for the Soviet Union. I'm in some difficulty about this because, please, the former celebration has not entirely been decided, and I'm almost talking about invitations before anyone can receive them, or before consultations have taken place in full.
Among the third of West Germany's population, which still remembers the war, there are mixed feelings about marking the anniversary. For the organization that represents prisoners of war, VE Day holds very bad memories indeed. And it's not because they're Nazi sympathizers, far from it. But May the 8th, 1945, was the day Werner Kiesling, the organization's president, was taken prisoner by the Russians, together with hundreds of thousands of other members. Kiesling was held under dreadful conditions for 5 years. He says now he understands that Britain wants to celebrate, but for him, it'll be a day for remembering.
40 years after the Allied forces liberated Europe, the commemorative events being planned by the different nations are generally low-key. The emphasis will be on celebrating peace rather than glorying in the Allied victory. The exception will be Russia, where there are plans for 6 days of special events and a massive rally at the Kremlin. The Communist Central Committee says the occasion should be used to unmask the militaristic plans of the United States and its NATO allies. For Mrs. Thatcher, the knowledge that West Germany was offended as being excluded from last year's D-Day celebrations is thought to explain her initial reluctance to agree to a national commemoration of VE Day in Britain. But now the official view has changed and plans are being considered for a special service at Westminster Abbey. In the West German city of Cologne, which was almost destroyed in the war, there are plans for a similar service. And at Belsen, the site of one of the most notorious Nazi concentration camps, there will be a memorial gathering attended by Chancellor Kohl. He says it will be a day of confrontation with his country's history. 10 years ago, the French cancelled the annual tribute at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but their attempts to abolish the VE Day celebrations were defeated by public opinion, and the ceremony was reinstated. Their theme this year will be reconciliation. President Reagan is still considering the form of America's celebrations. Like Mrs. Thatcher, he's wary of offending German feelings. Many of the celebrations will be left to individual groups and communities. In Norway, the people of Stavanger have invited back 700 Allied servicemen who liberated the town 40 years ago. The Royal British Legion is organising monthly pilgrimages for war widows to visit their husbands' graves. More than 400 widows are already planning to take advantage of the government's offer of financial help for those who can't afford the trip.
The plans to commemorate Victory in Europe Day. Later in the programme, a report on the children of a remote island who go over the seas to school. Their parents are asking the government to build them classrooms of their own. Now the time is 6:17.
Tonight's headlines: a rise in the mortgage rate of 1 to 1.25% has been recommended by the Building Societies Association. The rise is likely to take effect next month. The pound has ended its uncertain week with a closing price in London tonight of $1.12.1. The stock exchange has closed tonight at an all-time high. The FT index has passed 1,000 for the first time, closing at 1,004.4. Police in Pennycook think the person who killed 3 military men and snatched an army payroll may himself be a soldier. Parts of the west of England and Wales are still badly affected by the severe weather. A number of roads in Devon and Cornwall are blocked. Abroad now, and Florida's campaign to put a stop to drug smuggling has forced traffickers to move into adjoining states. Now, federal and state officials say they're losing the fight to control the drug trade. With consignments coming in by night on planes flying low to evade radar, it's turned into something of a war. A report from Brian Barron.
The Florida authorities have had tremendous success against cocaine smugglers.
Very pure quality.
But they're not winning the war against the drug kings despite thousands of arrests in a 3-year operation. For the smugglers are bypassing Florida and shipping in marijuana and cocaine by the ton to other southern states. From Texas to Georgia, the authorities talk of being overwhelmed. In New Orleans, a group of governors demanded more federal help.
They have the responsibility and the authority to employ even the use of our Army, Navy, and Air Force in efforts to stop this trafficking across our borders.
Hey, this is it. He's going in, man. There's a strip in. Yeah.
Most of the smugglers' flights from the Caribbean or South America are made at night at very low level. They often land on makeshift runways. As this film shot by American customs agents shows, the smugglers are taking huge risks and sometimes don't make it.
I told you we might see somebody die here. He just crashed. Did he crash? He's crashed. He's just crashed. There's a fireball. There's a fireball.
One smuggling tactic is trying to bribe local sheriffs. 9 have been arrested in 2 years.
I was approached, or some overtones were made to me that there would be $100,000 that I could have if I would have my men in certain areas where they wouldn't be bothering anyone else.
That sheriff turned them down, but that doesn't deter the smugglers. This is Brian Barron for the 6 o'clock news in Washington.
2 British engineers who've been held in Nigeria since last May were acquitted of serious charges in court today and then immediately rearrested by Lagos police. The 2 men, Kenneth Clark and Angus Patterson, both from Scotland, are employed by Bristow Helicopters. The British High Commission is trying to re-establish the reasons for the rearrest.
The Foreign Office has announced that the RAF airlift of emergency supplies for Ethiopia's famine victims is to be extended for another 2 months until the end of March. The government has also sent a message of condolence to Ethiopia after last weekend's rail crash in which nearly 400 people died.
An explosion followed by a fire at a refinery near Cologne has injured 33 people, at least 7 of them seriously. Flames and smoke rose 3,000 feet above the refinery. The explosion happened when a pipe carrying liquid gas broke. Police say there was no danger from escaping fumes. The coal boards say more miners than at any time since last November have given up their strike this week. The boards say 218 men returned today, making more than 2,800 this week alone. The miners' unions say the figures are grossly exaggerated. In Derbyshire, miners' wives and their supporters were joined by the MP for Chesterfield, Tony Benn. He insisted that in terms of public support, the miners had already won their case. Some who supported the strike totally were being forced back to work through starvation.
Wilfrid Bramble, who for 20 years played the part of Albert Steptoe in the TV series Steptoe and Son, has died. He was 72. He'd been ill for several months, and for the last 2 weeks he'd been treated for cancer at the Westminster Hospital in London. Wilfrid Bramble went into the theatre at an early age, but he was best known as the scruffy old rag-and-bone man Albert Steptoe, forever quarrelling with his son Harold, played by the actor Harry Corbett, who died 2 years ago. Together they became a national institution, forming one of the most popular partnerships in British television.
Hey, I remember this. Mussolini invades Albania. King Zog flees.
There's nothing, mate. We got king-size fleas here.
It's acting like a pigsty of filth! Filth! Filth!
And it smells, too.
I can't smell anything.
Of course you can't. You smell worse than your house does.
Wilfrid Bramble, who died today. England have won the second test in Madras. Their captain, David Gower, called it a great victory which would do wonders for English cricket. And Glasgow Celtic has been punished for the violent behaviour of its supporters during a game last December. They received a small fine and escaped a ban. With more details of the test and other sports news, here's Mark Austin.
So, as expected, England won the 4th test against India in Madras to go 2-1 up in the series with 1 match to play. But India's batsmen salvaged some pride by avoiding an innings defeat and a record-equalling last-wicket partnership ensured England had to bat again. They knocked off the runs for the loss of Fowler to win by 9 wickets.
Azharuddin had added only 2 to his overnight score of 103 when Pocock struck just the early blow England needed. Gower turned down the new ball, opting for spin. He was proved right when Ravi Shastri fell to Edmonds. Of all the Indian batsmen, Shastri had looked the best equipped to spend all day at the crease. With him gone, India were in deep trouble, but Saeed Kermani soon proved there was life left in the Indians. And Kapil Dev too was in no mood for surrender. The pair put on 82 in just 74 minutes. Cowans was recalled with the new ball and soon put an end to Kapil's brief but boisterous innings. Neil Foster also returned and soon trapped Shiva Rama, Foster's 11th wicket of the match. He looks a fine replacement for Bob Willis. Yadav went soon after lunch, 1 wicket left and an innings victory beckoning for England. When the end came, courtesy of Edmonds, Kermani and Sharma had made England bat again, their last wicket partnership equalling the record against England. With stacks of time left, England needed just 33 to win, but Fowler, who made 200 in the first innings, this time made just 2. But that was the only fright for England, Robinson and Gatting finishing the job. The winning runs were hit by Robinson. An historic victory for England. They need only a draw in the last test to become the first English side to win an overseas series since the tour to Australia in 1978 and 79. David Gower was understandably delighted.
A number of gentlemen played very well indeed. I think you have to give immense credit to people like Graham Fowler and Mike Gatting for their batting. And Neil Foster, especially with the ball. And his tally of wickets in this match was tremendous to see, having just included him in the side for this game. And then put it down to a team effort. We've worked very well together. We've kept working throughout the test. Once we were so many runs ahead, that put us in a very, very good position.
Well, probably almost as pleased as David Gower, although for different reasons, are the players and officials of Celtic Football Club. Celtic have escaped a ban from European competitions following crowd trouble in their replayed Cup Winners' Cup tie against Rapid Vienna last month. Instead, they've been fined £17,000 and ordered to play their next European match behind closed doors.
The game was replayed at Old Trafford, Manchester, after crowd trouble in the first match at Celtic's ground. The Glasgow side were facing defeat when one of their fans attacked the Austrian goalkeeper. After the game was over, another fan ran across the pitch and kicked the Austrian goalscorer in the groin. Both supporters were eventually jailed for 3 months, and the outlook for Celtic looked grim indeed. It had been expected that the club would face a ban from European competition for at least 2 years. There's great relief that they've escaped that. Playing their next match behind closed doors may cost them up to £250,000, but that's little compared with what, in all honesty, they must have been expecting. Manager David Hay gave his reaction.
I feel personally happy and relief for the players, because basically they had done nothing wrong. If anything, they'd lost a chance of playing the quarterfinals of the Cup this year, and for them to have suffered any more, I felt it was unfair.
Anyone travelling in the West Country at the moment is likely to be having difficulties, but for one group of school children there are problems every day. They live on the tiny island of Bryagh, one of the Scilly Isles. There is a school building on the island, but it's closed, and the Education Secretary, Sir Keith Joseph, has just rejected an appeal from the Isles of Scilly Council to reopen it. He says there aren't enough children to justify it. So, as Peter Gould reports, the children have to make a daily boat journey to the neighbouring island of Tresco.
On the Scillies, the locals say it's the coldest winter in 20 years, and no one feels it more than the children of Bryagh. The island has a population of 60, but the nearest school is across the water on neighbouring Tresco. So every morning at daybreak, the 8 primary pupils from Bryagh set off to catch not the school bus, but the school boat. And for these children, oilskins and life jackets are as much a part of their lives as satchels and school books. In winter, it's wet and often bitterly cold, although the crossing between the 2 islands takes only a few minutes. And at Tresco, the local version of a lollipop lady is waiting to see them all safely ashore. But many islanders feel that the journey is too tiring for the children, some of whom, like Katie Dan, are as young as 4 and a half. The campaign to reopen the school on Briar is being led by the island's councillor.
I think for the very young children from, say, 4 to 6 years old, then we're adding, I don't know how long, well over an hour's travelling time on top of their school time each day. So they're away from school, from home, from about 8 o'clock in the morning, and our children often it's 20 to 5 when they get home. I think it's a long day for a 4-year-old.
This is the old school on Briar. It was built by men of the island in their spare time and closed 12 years ago when the number of pupils fell from 6 to just 1. But islanders were promised then that it would reopen if numbers rose. And now there are 8 children. The Isles of Scilly Council is backing parents' demands for that pledge to be honoured. But the Education Secretary, Sir Keith Joseph, has rejected their request, and so the Briar children must continue their extraordinary journey. He says they will do better if they stay at the larger school on Tresco, and it will save him money. But the Education Authority has to pay out £4,000 a year for the hire of the boat. By the time the children arrive home, it's getting dark, and the cold journey has been too much for young Katie Dan.
Oh dear, are you freezing? Dear. That's it, let's take them off. What's cold? Your hands?
Never mind, darling.
And it's the younger children who are causing mothers most concern.
Not that we have anything against the school on Tresco, or the journey there particularly. It's just that it lengthens the school day so much. The children leave very early in the morning and don't return until sort of nearly 5 o'clock at night. Sometimes in wet weather, and sometimes it's choppy in the channel and whatever. They sometimes arrive on Tresco damp, and they have to remain like that all day.
But the Department of Education has made up its mind. Briar School will remain closed, and Sir Keith will go on paying the ferryman.
Rabbi Cliff Cohen, who was sacked from his synagogue for not taking his duties sufficiently seriously, has been rehearsing his comedy double act today. He and his partner, playing under the stage names of Muzzle and Toff, begin a series of late-night shows in a small London theatre on Monday. The rabbi has made no secret of wanting to be a success in show business. Gavin Esler watched him prepare for the big time.
It was all about the Messiah. The Lord is a-coming from his throne on high. Now, when you're Jewish...
When the curtain came down on Cliff Cohen's last performance as a rabbi in a London synagogue, he had shocked his congregation by telling jokes on serious occasions.
The Jewish tradition says that if all the Jews were to correctly observe the Sabbath twice in a row, says our tradition, that would bring the Messiah. Why twice? I don't quite know. I mean, you know, once would be such an improvement, but there we are. Tradition says twice.
When they sacked him, he said, if impresario Lou Grade phoned, he'd jump at any offers. Mr. Grade didn't call, but theatre manager Andrew Empson did.
He is a man that is, has a talent that is very special to himself. Let's face it, I mean, everybody likes, you know, a Jewish joke.
Today, Cliff was rehearsing with his partner Jane Ward for their opening night on Monday, in a theatre that used to be a mortuary. 2/3 of the seats for their musical comedy show have already been taken.
Now you can take it easy, let it pass you by. And when Messiah comes, you'll be the one to cry. But if you think Messiah's worth the suffering for, then eating is a no-no on a Yom Kippur. You got a glitter filling on your arm and head. And when it comes to pesos, then you don't eat bread. The book is lying open with your name on the page
in the Messianic age. Well, everybody gonna be a-going to the mikvah. Everybody gonna be singing hot tikvah. Everybody gonna have a wonderful time down here. Oh, glory, hallelujah. Everybody gonna be a real believer. Members of the Baba Jambonei Akiva. Everybody gonna have a wonderful time down here.
By Cliff Cohen, and that was the 6 o'clock news on Friday the 18th of January, the day on which the Met Office, explaining the absence of the blizzards they'd predicted across southern Britain, said, "We were right about there being a lot of snow, it just wasn't in the right area." Let's hope it's not in your area tonight. Have a good weekend, keep warm, we'll see you next week. Good night.
4:05 on Sunday, another chance to see the award-winning series of King's Country. Young naturalist and cameraman Simon King's unique view of the wildlife, which makes its home in and around the ponds and streams of the south, in King's Country, Freshwater, this Sunday at 4:05.
Now on BBC One, it's time for the latest news in the south. Bruce Parker and Debbie Thrower present South Today.
Winter's icy blast hits the vegetable trade. The South's market gardeners face a bleak prospect. It could mean shortages and even higher prices. Hello, good evening. The snow gets worse in the west, but it's not so bad in the east. Tonight we look at how to drive in the icy conditions and indeed how not to.
And it has to be better by rail, £130 million better, as British Rail unveil a new age of the train on the Brighton line. And our snow desk will be bringing you a full roundup of the latest effects of the weather, what's on this weekend and what's off.
And we start tonight with the havoc the snow and frost is bringing to vegetable producers in the south. Many market gardeners face severe financial losses. Crops have been ruined and spring planting is being delayed. This could lead to a shortage of vegetables in the shops and, of course, a hefty increase in prices. Charles Waste reports on that now.
Today's heavy snowfalls couldn't have come at a worse time for market gardeners whose crops have already been severely damaged by the recent overnight frosts. The owners of the Cloverville nursery near Wickham in Hampshire are facing losses of thousands of pounds. Not only has the snow covered fruit and vegetables, but it's blocked roads leading to the nursery, making it impossible for any remaining healthy vegetables to be taken by lorry to market. Much of the produce here, though, is destined to go nowhere. This field of cabbages are impossible to economically pick. The frost has also made many of them inedible. Leeks which should now be on their way to market are also buried beneath snow. More than half are thought to already be ruined. The nursery says the weather's led to losses of up to £400 a week, and that's only the beginning. Thousands of lettuces have been frost damaged. The continuing cold weather has also ensured that ground which should now be ready for planting is frozen solid inside the greenhouse. There's no space for the thousands of young lettuces still under propagation and due in the shops later this year. The nursery says it's impossible for them to insure against the cold weather. The premiums are just too high.
Well, it's so serious that, as you can see, we cannot find our crops. They're absolutely frozen into the ground, and it's impossible to do anything on the land today.
What effect's that going to have on your business?
Well, it's meant that everything's come to a standstill. We've got nothing going out today, and we're not going to try and do anything today.
What effect do you think all this is going to have on prices in the shops and the supply of goods generally in the shops at the moment?
Well, we're gradually seeing a shortage of vegetables, home-produced vegetables. This is going to get worse and worse, obviously, particularly as the roads get snowed up and they can't be brought in from other areas.
Do you think you'll be able to stay in business?
I'm sure we've seen worse times and we'll live to see the better ones.
But this is pretty bad, isn't it?
Probably as bad as it's going to get.
The snow will bring the South's growers even more problems in the coming months. When they finally do get their remaining fresh vegetables onto the shop shelves, they fear they could be competing with cheap foreign imports, which will further cut their market share in the years ahead.
But of course, it's not just the South's market gardeners who've been hit by the weather. Schools, businesses and public transport throughout the region have also been affected. John Andrews has the details now.
Well, the snow held up emergency services as they were on their way to rescue an elderly woman in a burning house at Downton near Salisbury. By the time they arrived, the woman, who was 82, was already dead. It's thought she fell onto an open fire. At Woodley near Reading, a woman fell down an embankment and lay seriously injured with a broken hip in the snow until she was spotted by a passerby walking a dog. The woman, Mrs. Doris Sharp, is undergoing surgery in hospital at Reading. A school bus and a gas van crashed in the icy conditions at Fareham this morning. The children weren't injured, but they were getting very cold until the police stepped in with their own minibus to take the youngsters on to school. 100 schools in Dorset have been closed today because of the conditions, and a special snow desk set up by Salisbury Police had 700 calls this morning. Several villages on Salisbury Plain have been cut off during the day, and even some major roads in Dorset and Wiltshire were closed for quite a while, although most are now open again. Gatwick Airport stayed open, but the regional airports at Bournemouth, Herne Airport and Eastleigh Airport near Southampton, they were both closed. The buses, too, have been having a hard time. Many services have been withdrawn because of blocked roads. But British Rail say they've been maintaining an almost full service, despite the extra difficulties they faced as a result of yesterday's strike. But let's pay tribute to the men who've been working around the clock to keep us moving, especially the driver of a gritting lorry at New Milton in the New Forest, whose truck slid off the road and straight into a car showroom, causing several £1,000s worth of damage to 2 cars.
Well, we'll be looking at some of the other casualties of the snow later. We've details of some of the events that have had to be called off because of the bad weather.
Well, British Rail are getting there, or so they promise us, and today they unveiled the final stage of plans to improve the Brighton line. More than £100 million has apparently been spent cutting the journey time to London and modernising that section of the southern region. Part of the package is a complete facelift for Brighton Station, as Andy Webb reports now.
The whole £130 million project is known as Operation New Look. British Rail admit that some of the equipment they're now using will be more at home in a railway museum. Much of it is more than 50 years old. But before long, Brighton's ancient signalling system will be replaced by a computer based at Crawley. Already much of the track has been renewed. In the next few months, engineers will straighten out many of the curves on the Brighton approach. Another target for modernisation is the massive New England Viaduct. 140 years old, it carries traffic over the A27 in the town centre. The work will mean that the road's completely closed for 4 days over Easter.
Well, ironically, it was exactly this stretch of road that was closed for half a day this week after an accident in the snow. Then there were traffic jams stretching way back up the Shoreham Road. Though British Rail say that they've chosen the 4 days over the Easter weekend, Good Friday to Easter Monday, specifically to avoid those kind of delays when they start work.
While work on the track is completed, all trains to and from London will have to go via Hove throughout the month of April, adding 10 minutes to the journey time. But after April, British Rail say trains will travel to Victoria in 52 minutes, a 6-minute saving on the normal time, but surely a costly one.
It's not just that, we're basically rebuilding a railway, much of which is 50 years old. The signalling in the Brighton area is 50 years old. And we certainly expect to get a lot of extra business over the years from the modernisation. And coupled with the track and re-signalling work, we're modernising the station itself, and we're making a start on modernising the trains too.
So is Brighton Station then going to look much different after all this?
Brighton Station will have a new attractive terrazzo tiled concourse. It will have a new indicator system of the electronic type that's used at London Termini, replacing the old indicator, and it will have a new barrier line.
And so soon it'll be all change at Brighton Station. The one piece of historic equipment with a future is the old indicator board, due for a trip itself to the National Railway Museum in York.
Well, thousands of people are suffering the misery of going without water in this cold weather. In Sussex, repair teams are working round the clock to fix burst water mains. The Southern Water Authority in Brighton is dealing with 15 emergency calls a day, compared with the usual 1 or 2. Tim Hurst reports.
Most water mains are laid beneath roads, so any escaping water in these temperatures immediately freezes and puts a layer of sheet ice across the road. The repair teams can often only guess about exactly where to dig their holes. The mains are 4 feet underground, and thousands of gallons of escaping water may seep some distance before rising to the surface.
We're probably having about 10 to 12 burst mains a day in the area.
What's causing?
Well, it's the bad weather. The temperatures are going well below freezing, the pipes are contracting, the ground's moving, and it's just snapping the mains.
But why at this particular time? Is it? I mean, the thaw hasn't even started yet.
No, it hasn't, but this is an exceptional winter. It's probably our worst winter for 22 years, since the 1962-63 winter.
Are you managing to cope with all the calls as you get them?
We're coping at the moment.
What do you think is going to be the worst period, when the thaw starts?
I think possibly it may well be that.
So what's your advice, if you have any?
Well, there's nothing the general public can do with regards to burst water mains, but their own particular plumbing, I would hope that now that they will go and lag all their pipes if it's not too late.
All emergency calls from the Brighton area are handled in the huge Southern Water Control Room at Falmer, from where the repair teams are directed by radio.
The Ridge, Woodingdean. Your name and address, sir?
It does seem strange that yesterday it was monitored.
And you say it's a burst main, it's clean water.
Spotting trouble before it happens should be easier now with a new weather radar, which can pinpoint approaching winter weather before it happens. It should also help in milder weather, when it's warm enough to rain. Then the water engineers can use it to predict floods.
Well, I dare one say it, but the people in London seem in their usual metropolitan way to think that because it didn't snow very much in London, it didn't snow anywhere at all. That's right,
That's what they were saying on the 6 o'clock news, isn't it?
That's right.
But you were a darn sight more accurate than most other people forecasting last night, weren't you, Keith?
Yes, I'd like to think we were, Debbie. We weren't perhaps quite right for Sussex. There was really not a great deal of snow there today. Perhaps unusually, the Isle of Wight was the worst hit place in our region. Not only in our region, it was the worst hit place really in the country in the last 12 hours or so. There was quite a lot of snow down there and out towards Dorset as well. I think possibly you're seeing the last of that now, and perhaps we're going to have 24, 36 hours of slightly better weather. This afternoon's satellite picture shows all the cloud that produced that snow during today being pushed along by this low pressure near Biscay there. The cloud is tending to swing westward here, taking its snow with it, and somewhat clearer weather coming in, although not that clear really, and we haven't quite seen the last of the snow yet. There's still some lingering around the Dorset, Weymouth, Portland area, but that is now drifting away from Dorset, and then we'll have a dry night, but a very misty one you'll find if you're driving around. A cold one, not quite as cold as it's been just lately, but nevertheless, temperatures which are now around freezing point are dropping further, so there'll be a widespread frost again. But as I say, a fairly dry night once this last bit of snow's cleared away from Dorset, and a dry day tomorrow. A brighter day. That isn't to say there'll be much sunshine around, I fancy, but nevertheless, the sky will look brighter, and it's going to be a dry day as well. Temperatures zooming up to around 2 degrees centigrade. I say that because that's a good deal higher than they've been for some time in the past. And furthermore, only very light winds of a very variable direction, so that will help it make it feel a little warmer. Later in the day, some southeasterlies picking up on the Dorset coast.
Strange, as the temperatures shot up to 0 today, it felt quite warm, actually. Indeed, while the snow may be easing off, it'll be too late, though, to save the majority of sporting events which should have taken place this weekend. Here's John Andrews again with the latest on the list of cancellations.
As far as the football programme is concerned, there's hardly a match being played at any level in the south this weekend. Southampton decided after yesterday's snowfall that their game at the Dell couldn't go on, and today's blizzards made conditions at the ground even worse. And while Sussex has escaped the worst of today's snow, the state of Brighton's Goldstone ground hasn't improved enough to allow their match against Carlisle to go on. Aldershot's home game against Halifax has also been cancelled. But for teams playing away, it's a brighter picture. The games between Middlesbrough and Portsmouth, Doncaster and Reading, and Rotherham against Bournemouth are still on. But soccer cancellations are just the tip of a very large iceberg. BMX riders belonging to the Poole Panthers, the Farnham District and the Gosport clubs won't be pedalling this weekend. And 2 show jumping events have been cancelled. They're at Stockland's Show Centre in Liphook and Burley Villa Arena at New Milton. Obviously the cold weather means many elderly folk are sensibly staying at home, so tomorrow's whist drive at the Avenue Church in Southampton and the Lions Club meeting at Ventnor are both off. Southampton's Opportunity Group for the Disabled has cancelled tomorrow's Skittles evening, and the next Handy Club meeting for the disabled in Swanage is off too. Spare a thought for 15 disappointed youngsters from Southampton who'll be staying in the warm this weekend. Their junior chamber survival course has been called off because in all this snow they just might not survive. Meanwhile, do bear in mind that Radio Solent will be broadcasting a special snow programme at 7:10 this evening. while Radio Sussex is manning a special phone line tomorrow to help bring you the very latest weather news.
Thanks, John. Now, if you have to go out in a car in this weather, it's best to know what you may be in for. Richard Vaughan has been picking up a few tips from the experts on just how to cope.
What you're about to see is how not to drive on snow and ice. The man who's demonstrating is Ian Taylor, racing driver and instructor at Thruxton.
As I come down here, I'm beginning to brake, and if you just brake without coming off the pedal at all, the wheels will just lock up and the car will just go in a straight line. At the same time, either the back end or the front end could break away. If that happens to you, it's so important again to come off the pedal. And unfortunately, most people in a panic situation just tend to keep their foot heavily on the brake and the car will just go in a straight line. And unfortunately, that's when they tend to hit things.
Just look at the difference in stopping distances between the white police car, where the driver pumps on and off the brakes, and the blue car, where the brakes are simply slammed on. The expert's advice is brake in a straight line before you reach a corner, not in the middle of the bend like this. And of course, if you get into a skid, turn the steering wheel in the opposite direction.
It's so important in these conditions to have light control. In other words, the driver who drives on ice tends to tense up, but if you just feel the steering very gently and do gear changing very smoothly, you can save yourself an awful lot of trouble.
It's more important than ever in weather like this to be very much aware of other drivers, because in snow and ice, it takes everybody that much longer to stop, perhaps as much as 10 times the distance it would normally take. Things to check before you even set out on your journey: antifreeze for your windscreen washers, very important this. If you can't get hold of any, a little methylated spirits will do the trick. And the manufacturer's recommended amount of antifreeze in your radiator. That is a must. And that's not all.
It's absolutely essential to make sure that the battery is properly maintained, that it is regularly charged, especially in weather like this, because when you're driving with a heater and washers and everything else going, perhaps there's more coming out of the battery than you're able to put in. Perhaps another little known thing is the fact about headlights, for instance. Typical headlight being used for a day. Look at the difference.
That's
with
right.
a quick wipe.
If you've been tempted to lower your tire pressures in the snow, the word from the experts is don't just leave them as they are. One of the most dangerous times is when the temperature is on the point of freezing. But what are the warning signs?
Probably one of the best telltale signs is if it begins to go very quiet, because the slush is no longer slush, it is turning to ice, and therefore it'll go very quiet and the steering will go very light. And if ever that happens, slow right down.
What if you're stuck out in the wilds and the car breaks down, there's a snowdrift, something like that? What should you do, Bill?
The best thing to do is to stay with the car. And obviously, if you're going to stay with the car, you should have made some preparation in the first instance to keep some warm clothing or a blanket in the back to prevent, obviously, hypothermia. A lot of people have, in fact, lost their life simply because they've abandoned the car and tried to walk for help. Stay with the car.
So there you are, now you all know. But now, who's for tennis? It may not seem appropriate at the moment to start thinking of summer sports, but at a village close to Basingstoke, you could indulge in a game of tennis, whatever the weather. We sent John Andrews, busy chap, along to investigate. Here's his report.
We're in the heart of North Hampshire in the depths of winter. There may be a watery sun filtering through, but even at midday it's still 4 degrees below freezing. The last place you would think to hear the thud of tennis balls against catgut. It seems to be coming from this bubble behind me. I'll go and investigate. Well, inside this strange plastic bubble are 2 top-class tennis courts where you can keep fit and practice your skills 365 days a year.
The Manydown Tennis Centre lives under a polythene bubble at a farm at Wootton St Lawrence near Basingstoke. Indoor courts are few and far between, and generally they don't come cheap. It can cost £15 an hour to hire one. The Manydown courts have cost £100,000 to build, but the hire fee is a more reasonable £5 an hour.
Tennis now, if you're looking to play it seriously, has to be played all year round. One can do a certain amount of fitness, but you have to do some work on the court to keep your timing in and everything, to be able to keep up with people now who are playing all year round, especially abroad. So especially for youngsters who are developing their game, something like this, without it, they would never make the top grade.
They wouldn't have a chance, in my opinion, competing abroad, where they play indoor tennis all the time and all year round.
The actual bubble itself is designed to be able to play through the winter, but at a reasonable and affordable cost. And that is the only way, really, that the youngsters and the people who matter can afford to play tennis, and we can broaden the base of the game that way.
The strange bubble by the farmyard has been built by farmer Hugh Oliver Bellasis in a corner of his 5,000-acre estate. But why branch out from the livestock and Land Rover world of farming into all-weather tennis?
The farming community are under a certain amount of pressure with surpluses in Europe. And we've looked at, first of all, golf courses, and we went into it quite seriously. We got planning permission, and in fact found that it wasn't financially viable. And so we then hit upon the idea of looking at tennis courts and an indoor facility particularly. It is much cheaper, and of course the thing that has actually killed off two of the big tennis centres in this country is the fact that they built a structure at £35 a square foot, and they've gone bust twice or three times. So you've got to keep your capital costs down, which enables you to keep your cost of playing down, and then we'll encourage more people to play tennis, which is what we need to produce really good tennis players.
Third thing is the racket should be extended right out.
Although the centre is going to be most attractive to developing young players and committed competitors, anyone can book a court for a knock-around or join the coaching classes, complete with video playback. Watching McEnroe and Lendl in action will never be the same after you've seen your own awful service in full-colour close-up. Those dreams of winning Wimbledon may mean more work than you'd imagined.
Practicing a volley now, keeping the ball.
All you need now is the sound of Dan Maskell, that well-known tennis voice, and you could actually imagine that it could be summer. Well, now, you may remember the Southampton tramp who narrowly escaped being crushed in a refuse skip. Well, he's now left hospital. He'd fallen asleep in the skip, which was loaded onto the back of a rubbish lorry. He spent 2 weeks in hospital, but now he's made a full recovery and is settling into a new home. Charles Wace reports.
Jimmy Hanafi fell asleep in the skip after having far too much to drink earlier this month. He only woke up when the crusher started working. Horrified refuse operators only stopped the machine when they heard his screams. Jimmy was taken to Southampton General Hospital, where he was treated for fractured ribs, shock and bruising. After 2 weeks' treatment in a private room, sheltered from the bitter cold outside, Jimmy, who's 51, was pronounced fit enough by doctors to leave. He says he remembers nothing of the night he spent in the refuse skip, having consumed 20 pints of beer.
You're now going into bed and breakfast accommodation. Will that suit you?
Oh yeah, it's a good house.
Will you stay there?
Yeah.
What about the drink? You can give up the drink?
Somebody's up for me to do that. That money is no good to me. It only lasts me hours.
So you're still looking to have a drink?
Good session.
After his 2-week stay at the hospital, Jimmy, who's still weak on his legs, seemed anxious to leave.
Okay, you'd be good, wouldn't you, at home? Go on then.
You're terrible, sweetheart.
Because of the cold weather, ambulance services in Hampshire have been dealing with emergency cases only. So the hospital administrator asked South today to take Jimmy the several miles to his new bed and breakfast accommodation provided by the social services. Jimmy says that now that he's got his own room in a warm house, he'll be much more selective about where he sleeps in the future.
Well, good luck to Jimmy, and I think at this stage of the programme, the end of it, we ought to say well done to all the postmen, the milkmen, the paper boys, and of course the men who've been out gritting the roads, who are doing a splendid job.
Say something nice about them today.
I'm saying something nice about them today, because in fact the roads were superbly clear. Well done, you gritting men all over the south and all our counties. We're very, very proud of you.
We are indeed.
That's it, you're back tomorrow, aren't you?
5:15 tomorrow, so tune in to us then.
Good night.
Friday night entertainment on BBC One. In a moment, Blankety Blank, and then at 7:30, Terry and June.
You've got a lovely, lovely green dress in there.
That old thing, I can't wear that.
Makes you look like $1 million.
Yes, all green and wrinkled.
At 8 o'clock, detectives Starsky and Hutch employ a cafe owner with psychic powers to help them solve a kidnap.
Daddy, they promised not to hurt me.